Okay, class, today I am going to talk to you guys about lesson 2 of chapter 16. But first I want to summarize a little bit about what we covered yesterday in lesson 1 in the lead up to the Civil War. So yesterday we talked about what the big debate over slavery was between the two regions of the South and the North. Okay, so basically the big debate was over new regions that were going to become states. And when a new state would come up, the North and the South would want it to either be a free state or a slave state. The South wanted the new states to be a slave state, and the North wanted them to be a free state. And really the biggest thing was the political power that came into play between the North and the South. The South had a majority in the Senate, which is by state representation. So if they could get more states that were slave states, they would get more senators in the Senate. And also it helped them in the House of Representatives, which is population-based, which the North controlled. And the North really wanted more states because they could gain ground in the Senate. So the first big fight that took place, we talked about yesterday, was when Missouri joined the Union, and Missouri wanted to be a slave state. And the North rejected that in Congress and the Senate, which they controlled. So the first compromise was the Missouri Compromise. So what that was is that, yeah, Missouri could join as a slave state, but anything north to the southern border of Missouri, from then on that would become a state would be a free state. And also at that time, Maine became a state, and it was admitted as a free state. Therefore, they got by for now. And then California came along, and they wanted to be a free state. So what did the South want to do? They wanted something that would be, they thought would be fair as a compensation. So in 1815, there was another compromise where the fugitive slave law was strengthened even more than it already was. And then finally, this all culminated with the Nebraska-Kansas Act. And that's where Congress decided to compromise yet again on these two new states that wanted to join the Union, which Union was the United States and all the states that were a part of it. So what they decided is that it would come down to the voters to decide whether it be a slave state or a free state. Well, as a result, it brought a lot of infighting between the people that wanted slavery and people that didn't. They would rush to that state, and being so, the vote would come down to the settlers. Everybody was running there to try to tip the scale to either make these two states either a slave state or a free state. And the final straw that just broke this whole thing out was when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, which really gave the North more power than the South. So at that point, that's when the Southern states began to secede. Now, I'm going to give you a quick overview here of how the war gets started, and then you guys will move on and read about that in lesson 2. So, marching to battle. Now, a civil war is a war fought between regions of one nation. There's been many nations that have fought against each other, and this is no exception. So the Civil War would begin when South Carolina men surrounded a Union fort in Charleston Harbor. And what they did is they surrounded the fort with the Union soldiers inside of it, and when the Union soldiers refused to surrender, the men from South Carolina opened fire, and therefore that started the first combat and the beginning of the Civil War, which the Confederates claimed victory for seizing the fort. So both armies mobilized, and mobilized is just another word for preparing for war. And this was a war that forced many northern and southern friends to fight against each other. So this was one nation, and a lot of people that knew each other but felt different about their positions on slavery and whether it should be allowed or not. Okay, so First, I want to talk about the North. Initially, it had some advantages. And first off, they have a larger population, meaning that there could be more volunteers. And when I mean volunteers, we're people who could choose to become soldiers and fight for the North. Also, the North had more industry, money, railroads, so it could easily supply, feed, and move its army, which was a huge advantage. And the North also had its great leader, Abraham Lincoln, which really was the biggest advantage of all, having a great leader. So the South, they did have some challenges. They had a lot fewer people than the North, so they couldn't get as many volunteers as the North could. And also, 1/3 of their population were enslaved people, and of course, they couldn't have the enslaved people fight for them, and they probably wouldn't have anyways. Also, money, industry, and railroads were much more scarce compared to the North. But one thing that the South did have that the North didn't was Robert E. Lee, who was a great general, and he was a great example of people with divided loyalties and interests, because he was actually a supporter of the Union. And President Lincoln even offered him the job of being the top general to fight for the Union. But his home was in Virginia, and Virginia was a Confederate state. Virginia was for slavery. And, let's see. Anyways, so, this had a bit of a hiccup here. But anyways, so he decided to fight for the South, and that was a big advantage for them. So moving right along here, were the first big battles that took place. And the first battle was the Battle of Bull Run. And it was fought just south of Washington, D.C. And the Union was very confident that they could win this battle. And even they were so confident they even brought spectators from the capital of Washington, D.C. to come watch it. Well, much to their surprise, the Confederates won the battle. They won the very first major battle of the Civil War, and a lot of the spectators were terrified, and they fled back to the city. And at that point, everybody really realized, especially the Union General Ulysses S. Grant, that this was going to be a very long and hard-fought war. So the Union had this big thing that was called the Anaconda Plan. It was a 3-part plan to winning the war. They thought that if they could accomplish these 3 things, that they could win the war. The first was a blockade. And what a blockade is when ports are blocked from the sea with ships. And that's what the Union did. They sent ships out there, and they prevented trade from coming into the city, supplies, and everything else. Also, the second part was to control the Mississippi River. If they could get control of the Mississippi River, they could split the Confederacy in half, because there would be Confederacy states on this side of the Mississippi and Confederacy states on the other side. So that would make it very tough for them to communicate with each other. And then the final part of the Anaconda Plan was to send armies from the east and the west. Okay, so the big turning point of the battle between the North and the South was the Battle of Vicksburg and Gettysburg. And the Gettysburg battle was truly a massacre. More Southern soldiers were killed or wounded at Gettysburg than in any other battle in the war. It was just an atrocious war, and it was demoralizing for the Confederate Army. And then the Battle of Vicksburg resulted in the Union gaining complete control of the Mississippi River, which was one of the main parts of the Anaconda Plan. So just to wrap this up, the victories fulfilled one key part of the Anaconda Plan, which was control of the Mississippi River, and it cut the Confederacy in half. And the Battle of Gettysburg gave the Union the strong belief that Robert E. Lee could be defeated. So now I'm going to have you guys read your books, and that concludes my presentation.